Hi, my name is Joe Clarke, and today we're going to be talking about always-on infrastructure for VMware Horizon environments. And always-on is a really interesting concept because when we examine a virtual desktop infrastructure and availability, there are some very important key attributes that we have to take into effect. That when we're looking at RTO, and RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective. This basically means it's the amount of time it'll take you to fail from a catastrophic failure. That the closer to zero we get versus something like, say, 24 hours, that there is definitely an associated cost with getting closer to a zero RTO, or Recovery Time Objective. And that's true of all enterprise systems. But today what we're going to be talking about is how to architect an always-on infrastructure, which allows us to quickly fail over with simple processes between a multi-site configuration. And a big part of what we design when we are examining how to do this is what we call a PodBlock Architecture. And in a Horizon nomenclature, a pod is essentially a group of virtual desktops and management components that are managed together. There's one group of management components. And the reason we call it pod and block is because inside of a pod, we oftentimes architect multiple different blocks. And those blocks have specific purposes inside of that configuration. We typically have management blocks, which hold the management components of the solution. And then we might have different virtual desktop clusters inside of each block that are configured inside of a pod. For example, we might have a very user-dense workload of task workers here. We might have some power users in a different cluster that have some graphics cards in them. Those sort of things. And when we look at the PodBlock architecture and we're designing across sites, more often than not, we find that a like-for-like configuration is something that a lot of customers are going with and have been going with. One of the interesting things that we have been doing as Advizex is taking a look at alternative architectures for PodBlock. Now, when we have an always-on configuration, again, we're keeping RTO in mind as we're designing it. We almost always need some kind of global server load balancing that's going to keep our environments load balanced and available between geographic regions. So if we have a pod on the East Coast and a pod on the West Coast, that's going to be a configuration where we're definitely going to need some load balancing that is aware of the service, where users should be placed when they connect, and how to get them back to sessions when they reconnect potentially from a different geographic region. One of the very interesting things that we are working on now is actually changing the way that we look at PodBlock design in a way of saying instead of like-for-like architecture, we can actually do what's called like-for-scalable. And when we talk about like-for-scalable, what do you mean? There's an offering called VMware Cloud on AWS, and that allows us to run VMware Horizon. And this is the exact same build of VMware Horizon that is actually being run right here in our always-on infrastructure. And if we take a look at that, the minimum requirements to run VMware Cloud on AWS is simply a 3-host configuration. With an average of 12 minutes per host of provisioning, you can actually have a like-for-scalable configuration between a production pod and one that is existing on Amazon's cloud hardware running the native Horizon tools with the native entitlements that get people into desktops on both sides. And what that means is from a cost savings perspective, it actually allows you to save money because instead of having like-for-like infrastructures where you have paying for management and all sorts of blocks, you can actually pay for what it takes to get templates and your pools ready to go in the cloud environment. And then when it's time for you to actually perform, say, a failure test, DR tests happen all the time with most of my customers. If we want to build that out, we can actually build that out so that it actually spans and covers multiple different hosts and allows us to scale that environment out. So this has been a quick look at how we design PodBlock architectures, a little bit about RTOs, and how we've been running Horizon on VMware Cloud and AWS. Thanks for watching.